Hi everybody, I'm Owen Hunt, the president of WebDev UW this semester, and tonight I'll be going over the basics of the Vue.js web development framework. It's a framework that I think some people have probably heard of. It's not quite as popular as React, but a lot of it is similar and is being used by big companies as well. So I wanted to give our members, especially those with not as much web development experience, some information and some guidance to go off of with Webhacks coming up here. And I think that Vue is a great tool to be able to use and especially useful for beginners. So to get started, what is Vue.js, or just Vue as most people call it? Vue is a web development framework, which means that it's a technology that you can use to create a web application. Compared to a library like React, it's a little bit more all-encompassing and asks a little bit more of you in terms of adoption, but it also is powerful enough to be able to do just about anything. So by using a framework, you're able to create websites in a different way than just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. However, Vue is also very similar to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in its use of their languages within its files and how it leverages existing knowledge that you might have. So for those of you who are familiar with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for the purposes of web development, you'll be able to use all of that existing knowledge within Vue in order to create some great websites. That also means that it's got a very shallow learning curve. It's easy to pick up and utilize, having just the knowledge of HTML and CSS and JavaScript that you already have. And as you learn more, you'll be able to create better products. It's very easy to get a project started and compiled, and the development cycle runs pretty quickly, so it's not any massive compilation burden or overhead. It's easy enough to get going, which I think makes it pretty fun to use and to get your hands dirty with. So a lot of you probably have seen React before. If you've been a member of this club in the past semesters, you've probably been to some of our meetings about React. React is definitely the most popular web library or framework out there these days, and you'll see a lot about it if you look up what's popular in web development. But Vue is also growing, and for a lot of the reasons that I said on the previous slide, it's very worthwhile to consider using. Like I said, it's quick to learn because of how similar it is to HTML and CSS, and that's especially useful for newer members of our club who want to create a project for Webhacks but don't know exactly where to start. It's easy to get set up with its toolchain. You don't need to learn how to use a build system, how to deploy to any server or anything like that, and it scales to small projects and large projects quite nicely, similar to how React does. But it, like I said, is easier to pick up. Some of the cons of it include the syntax being a little bit more restricted. It does use some combinations of concepts from Angular and React, the three big ones, I would say. And so if you've used Angular before, some of it might seem familiar. If you've only used React before, it'll seem kind of scary. But overall, the syntax is easy enough to pick up and pretty similar in a lot of ways to stuff that's already out there. So it's definitely been tested. And like I said, because React is more popular, it has more resources out there. Vue is not quite as well tutorialized by things like YouTube and things like that. But you'll still be able to find plenty of options in that regard. It's definitely not a secret or anything like that, and it's getting more and more popular over time, so that's changing as well. But for the most part, I wanted to make this tutorial pretty interactive, going over how Vue works and how to develop in it. So I'm going to switch over to a sandbox here that I was able to get set up here. It's on a site called Stack Blitz, and I based it off of a Vue wrapper framework called Vite with Vite. But in general, it's pretty similar to how Vue development goes in any project you might use it with. And then I'll also be sharing a link to this at the end of the presentation so that members can play with it and see what it's like to develop in Vue. So, to start with, if you remember any of our React tutorials, then you might remember some of the details about what Vue or what React is good for compared to developing in just HTML and CSS. And a big part of that is how it composes and how you can create changes to an application without having to make changes across like 6 or 10 or however many different places that you might use the same design. So let's show that first here by putting together a component. I've got another window open that I've got some stuff I'll be copying and pasting in here. But to start, we're going to make a hello world component. We'll just call that hello world.vue. So .vue is the extension on all Vue files. And then the general construction of each Vue file goes as follows. You're going to have 3 top-level tags for the most part in most files, and that's going to be template, which is for HTML. You'll have script, which is for, as you might be able to guess, JavaScript. And then you'll also have style, which is for your CSS. And so in one of these files, you will be able to, like I said, put in the 3 different main web dev languages and use them the same as you would expect for the most part. So here we can put in an h1 tag and then put hello world in here. And so now, if we go back to the main app.vue, where the app comes from, you can see I've got hello world in the template here being rendered. And if I wanted to, I could copy and paste it a few times, and we would get a bunch of hello worlds. But now, if I wanted to say hello new world, then you can see it only changes the one. I have to go through and change them all. Versus if I was able to use some sort of composition and reuse, then it would be much simpler. So what we're going to do then is import the hello world component from that file. So we're just going to type in that whole name here, and then we'll be able to use that in a similar way to how you would in React. Use it as a tag like this, and we'll see it show up here. And then we can do like we did before and have a few different components of it. And now if we make changes to that component, they all show up over here. So that is the big benefit of having a library or a framework that lets you do reuse and composition like this, is you're able to put similar things in similar places and change the way they all behave at once, instead of having to just have one big HTML file that is the layout of your entire app all at once, or at least of that page. So now we can also expand on this with some more typical features of HTML. So I'm going to just copy and paste in a couple things here so we can see. I added a paragraph for just details of the page. And then we can also add some CSS here. So let's say we wanted to make the title nice color like this, which is the color of Vue green, I believe. And so you can see here, now they've all changed color. I think you guys understand how that all works. So I'm just going to limit us to 1 for now. And a great thing about how style works here is that it is able to be scoped. If you put the word scoped in the style tag, then what that means is that any of the rules you have in there won't apply to the other components or other files that have the same components. So you can see here, if we put another header, even though this rule changes the color of h1 components, if we have another h1 component that isn't in this file, it won't have that rule. And so by scoping your CSS, it's easy to make sure that the changes that you make are limited to the specific component that you're looking at and won't cause any weird behavior or break anything that was working on a different component. We can also use, just like in normal CSS, the same selectors. So here we can select the paragraph that has the ID greeting, and let's give it a new font family. Let's just say Arial. And so now you can see the paragraph here has a different font than before. And then one feature that I think is really great about this is the ability to set your CSS language. For those of you who are more advanced in CSS, you might have heard of Sass or SCSS, which lets you use a lot of advanced features. So things like variables we can set up here. So we can say Vue green to define that color here. And then we'll take that and put it here. And now we can use that variable. Variables start with a $ in Sass. So now we can use that here. And if we reload, we'll see that that did not work because I used the wrong symbol there as well. But now there it is. And we can also use a Sass feature of nesting. So now we can have spans that are within the greeting ID have the color also be Vue green. So those are some nice features of Sass that we're able to use really simply. So for those of you who don't know any Sass or advanced CSS preprocessors, that's totally fine. You're able to just use normal CSS. But if you know any advanced Sass or anything like that, then you're able to leverage that pretty quickly and easily within, I think this is a Vite feature, but like I said, it's easy enough to set up Vite for your project, and that'll be one of the resources that I share at the end as well. So that is the general basics of HTML and CSS within Vue. Before I go on to the next components we're going to look at, does anybody have any questions? All right, hearing none, then let's move on to the next big feature that a lot of you who are used to React are probably wanting to know about, which is passing in props to a component. So if we make another component here, let's call it profile, then we're going to start with the script tag up at the top here. So you can put in here, we're going to do a script setup, which is how Vue 3 uses script. Vue 2 and Vue 3 are the two most recent versions of Vue. Vue 2 is more based on objects and properties in terms of how it defines things. So it uses a few object-oriented concepts versus Vue 3, which has moved towards a little bit more of a functional paradigm, which, if you know me and my proclivity for functional components in React versus class components, you'll know why I'm choosing to show off Vue 3 instead of Vue 2. But in here, we're going to define props and just set a few props that we want to pass in to our objects. We'll do things like name, age, and bio. And we'll set the types for each of those to just standard JavaScript types like string and number. And then we'll do our template here. And we'll put in our HTML components. So we can have name, age, and bio. And so just like before, we'll be able to import that component. So I'll just copy and paste that in here. And then we can put a profile right here. And we can see now there's name, age, and bio. And because we haven't set these to use any of these values, they're just showing those text right here. The way that you use values from JavaScript in Vue is you just wrap them in the double curly braces, sometimes called the mustache in the documentation. And so now all three of those are wrapped in there. We'll see they go away now because none of these have any values being passed in. The way you pass in values, just like in React, is you set them in the attributes of the component. So we'll just say the name here is Owen, age is 22, and bio is webdev UW president. And you can see as I've typed those in, they've shown up here in the profile component because of how we pass them in. So now if we wanted to make a new profile, we would just have to change these, and we'll be able to have multiple components that have different values being passed in. And so now if we wanted to change details about them, we can put more information in, that kind of thing, and see it up here for both of them. And so this is how using a framework like Vue or React really lets you develop quickly and efficiently. I was able to make those changes to all those components with just one change here instead of having to go across the whole product. And so that's quite nice. Another thing that you might then ask for after doing something like this, there are ways to do for loops and conditions in Vue. So if you're used to React, in React you would do something like for like p in profiles. Here, let me copy over the profiles that I have over here. So all variables are going to have to be defined in JavaScript. So here I've got just an array of objects of each of these profiles. And so then what we can do is pass them in like this. The way that passing in values works in Vue is a little bit different from React. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I thought I heard someone talk. If you do have any questions, don't hesitate to interrupt me. I am happy to answer any questions you might have. But in order to pass in a JavaScript value instead of just a string here, the syntax for it is to just put a colon before the property here. So you can see when I put the colon here, it changed this to show up as Owen because the syntax highlighting is different because it thinks it's JavaScript now. So because this is just a string, you still do want to make it a string. So we can probably omit the one here. But if we do this on age, you'll see now that 22 is highlighted like a number. And this is especially important for when we want to pass in values like a profile. So if we were going to pass in the first one from profiles, we could do profiles 0.name. And you can see it's still passing in Owen here because that's the first name. If we wanted to do the second element of profiles, now you can see it's Ryan. And so we can do it like that. If we wanted to do a for loop to loop over all those, then we just write v_for. And so in Vue, the sort of special properties that do special things for language, I'll start with a v hyphen. So there's things like v_for, v_if, and even this colon here is shorthand for v something that I don't remember off the top of my head. But the shorthand is easy enough to remember. But for the v_for, we're going to say p in profiles, and that's going to loop over all of the profiles. And then we're going to want to put p.name for the name. We're going to want to do p.age for the age, and for the bio, we'll do p.bio. And now you can see we've got two different profile components here with the different data from in the JavaScript part. If I add another profile here for Aiden, forgive me if I get your age wrong, but we're able to modify this data and have it show up here as well. Yeah, so that is how you do a for loop in Vue. Pretty simple, easy syntax to see here. So very easy to take data, especially data that you might be fetching from a server, from the internet, just reading in data, manipulating it, and then wanting to render that manipulated data. This is how you're going to do it in Vue. Anybody have any questions on that? All right, cool. So then, hand in hand with props, if you know React, then the other big consideration that varies a little bit from your typical HTML and JS is state. And so let's create a counter that we can use to show how state or the concept of state works in Vue. So again, we're going to do script setup, add a template here, and then in here we're going to import ref from Vue. Ref is the function that we use to set up state. So if you're used to functional components in React, ref is pretty much the exact equivalent of useState. So we're going to say const value, or let's say count equals ref, and we'll start the count at 0. So the ref takes in the initial value here, and it's going to store it in a component in a value called count. So then if we put a p tag here, we can say count. And then we'll just import that into our app here. So let me do that. And we can put a counter. So now we can see count 0 here. And then if we add a button, then we'll be able to manipulate it. So the way that you add on-click listeners, there is v on, which is the Vue syntax for it, and we can do count plus plus, and then I don't think that that's right. Let me change it to the syntax that. Here we go. This is. So it's got something going on here. I think that it might be that it added a 1 somewhere. When we click this, you can see it really wants the count to be pretty high. If we refresh, then it'll go back to 0. Here we go. So now you can see when we click, this at click is short for v on click, and then it runs the inside here whenever you click on the inside. And so you can see the state is updating and the count is going up, and it's automatically being pushed to the page. You don't need to use set state or anything fancy. Vue is very smart about noticing when a value is changed and rendering based on it. And so it's very efficient at doing those checks and making those changes to the point where you don't need to use any of the sort of boilerplate like React does for set state and that kind of thing, which I think is very nice, especially for beginners. And just like in React, all of the state is individual to each component. So you can see if we have a bunch of different counters, they all increment separately from each other. You don't have to worry about making an array to store a bunch of different values. They can all have their own state internal to them. I'm going to copy over some CSS here just to make it look a little bit nicer. Put these inside of a div. And so you can see the same rules for CSS and classes and things like that all apply here. So now we've got flex going, and the button shows up right next to the count. So that is state. There's definitely more advanced topics that we could get into there in terms of how state updates, how to perform advanced state updates, and different ways of interacting with it. But for now, I think that is a pretty good summary. And then the other way that managing state is nice in Vue is if you have a component like a form. So let's make an input dot or a text input dot view. I'll just copy and paste the code into this one and then explain it because a lot of it is the same. We're going to import ref again, and we're going to define props again. So we're going to combine what we learned from profile and counter. And then here, we're going to use the vModel attribute. And what that does is it syncs up the text variable here with the contents of the input. And so what this does is it means that you don't need to set an like at change or anything like that to say text equals, like, I'm sure if you know React, this will look familiar. We'll say like text equals e.target.value. You don't need to do anything like that. Vue will automatically sync up the value here with the variable. So if we copy that into here, I'm working on it, I promise. Alright, it's called text input. Then you can see when I type something in here, it updates the value in text and then it renders it down here. And so this way you're able to simply set up a form and use the data in it without needing to set up a bunch of different functions and callbacks and things like that. I think then that covers most of what. Oh, and we also have the props that we pass in. So the hint that'll show up here. As you can see, I have it set up to use for the placeholder hint or the string name. And that's because all of these values that we're setting here with these special Vue attributes are all expressions. And so you can use any JavaScript expression in them. So that means an expression like this, or you can use like a ternary like that. Anything that's an expression is usable there, the same as inside curly braces in React, for example. And so then, because we didn't pass in a hint, it's using name. If we go back here and we say hint equals enter your name, then we'll see it update there. And so now you can see with just this pretty simple code here, we've got a bunch of different attributes and components and things showing up on our page. There are some parts that are interactive that let you mock up a form or anything like that. And in general, this was pretty quick to set up, plus or minus a few copy and paste that I did. But at this point, I think that I've covered the basics of Vue and am looking forward to seeing what all of you are able to make with your newfound knowledge. I do have a few additional resources that I'll be linking here. And so this is a Vue.js tutorial. It's an interactive tutorial that puts you through a few of the different things we covered here and some of the more advanced techniques, things like computed properties and watchers and slots. Slots is a fun technique to use where you can pass components into components and still have them as parents, which is something that I think you can do in React, but I don't see used all that often and is kind of difficult compared to Vue, which makes it pretty easy and pretty nice to use. So definitely, if you're interested in using Vue, go through the tutorial and learn from it. And then Vite is the toolchain that was set up and running in the demo I just showed, and is a framework for getting Vue 3 running and installed pretty simply and easily. If you're planning on using Vue for webhacks, this is what I would recommend for getting it set up on your machine and initialized. If for whatever reason you end up wanting to use Vue 2 instead of Vue 3, I used Nuxt when I learned Vue back when Vue 2 was cutting edge, and I think that it is very well supported as well. But Vite, I think, is where it's at these days. And then here's a comparison back from V2 of Vue, but all the things are the same, all the points they make about the differences and pros and cons of Vue versus React in a bit more detail for those of you who are trying to decide if you already know React, if you want to use Vue instead. And so you'll be able to take a look at all these resources. And then on the topic of webhacks, we're still finalizing some of the details, but we'll be sending them all out in Discord pretty soon here. The kickoff is going to be at 3 p.m. on Thursday, and for those of you who can't make it, we'll be sending all the info from that as well. But the general timeline of the hackathon will be kickoff. We'll have an event for that on Thursday, going over the themes, introducing our sponsor, and then a little bit of team formation as well for those of you who signed up as individuals. And then throughout the weekend, we'll have some informal checkpoints, things like sending us the name of your project, showing some screenshots, sending the domain if you've registered a domain for your website, and that kind of thing, just to get everybody a little bit involved and active in the Discord channels if you aren't already at that point. And at 3 p.m. on Sunday, we'll be closing submissions, and then judging, holding closing ceremonies, and giving out awards. Additionally, throughout the weekend, we have some events planned from our sponsor, Sub-Zero. So keep an eye out for when those times get announced. We're really looking forward to having them come in and talk about what it's like to work at Sub-Zero and what opportunities they might have there. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them in the Discord, and we'll do our best to answer them as soon as possible. All right. Anybody have any questions? All right, hearing none, I think that covers it. So thank you everybody who came to this meeting, and I hope you all were able to learn something and are looking forward to using Vue for your next project.